Hey, fellow superhero cinephiles. Did you know that almost 30% of adults say they haven't read a book in the past year? The primary reason why is a lack of time. Well, Audible's here to help with the gift of found time. Thanks to Audible, you can listen to audiobooks like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, or Slugfest, inside the epic 50-year battle between Marvel and DC. Read up on the history of superheroes in comics and movies with Grant Morrison's Super Gods. You can also check out Vanguard, my original superhero novel series, or try The Vril Agenda or The Adventures of Fortune McCall, both of which were written by our dearly departed host emeritus, Derek Ferguson. Whatever you're looking for, Audible has thousands of titles that you can consume while commuting, exercising, cooking, or just relaxing at home. And not only audiobooks, an Audible membership also gives you access to tons of content like podcasts, theatrical performances, and exclusive Audible originals that you won't find anywhere else. To give you a taste of what you can get, Audible has partnered with this show to provide listeners with a free 30-day trial. All you have to do is go to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod, and with your free trial, you get one free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. In fact, you get to keep those titles even if you cancel before the trial is over. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod and start your free trial today.
This is Project Insight. 3 next-generation helicarriers synced to a network of targeting satellites.
Launch from the Lemurian star.
Once we get them in the air, they never need to come down. Continuous suborbital flight courtesy of our new repulsor engines.
Stark?
He had a few suggestions once he got an up-close look at our old turbines. These new long-range precision guns can eliminate 1,000 hostiles a minute. The satellites can read a terrorist's DNA before he steps outside his spider hole. We're gonna neutralize a lot of threats before they even happen.
Thought the punishment usually came after the crime.
We can't afford to wait that long.
Who's we?
After New York, I convinced the World Security Council we needed a quantum surge in threat analysis. For once, we're way ahead of the curve.
By holding a gun to everyone on Earth and calling it protection.
You know, I read those SSR files. Greatest Generation? You guys did some nasty stuff.
Yeah. We compromised. Sometimes in ways that made us not sleep so well. But we did it so that people could be free. This isn't freedom. This is fear.
S.H.I.E.L.D. takes the world as it is, not as we'd like it to be. And it's getting damn near past time for you to get with that program, Cap.
Don't hold your breath.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Barry Constantine, and today I'd like to welcome a guest to the show, a guy I've known for a few years now, who's also been a longtime listener of the show. I've actually done a few other podcasts with him before in the past. He's been a guest on a few shows I've done in the past, and that's Bobby Nash. Bobby, how you doing today?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for agreeing to come on. Before we get started, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, I'm primarily an author. I write novels, comic books, short stories. Actually, I'm very excited. I just had my first audio drama, full cast audio drama that I wrote.
Nice.
Debuted last week. It was a short piece I did for a company called On Another Wavelength, where I took a short story that I had written and adapted it into the full cast screenplay format, and they performed it. And listening to it was just, there was something very special about listening to it, because I'm not, usually when you write books, you hear it in your head, but to hear actually other people bring your characters to life, it's very unique and satisfying. So that was new this week. So
Very
I write
cool.
things like but I write all kinds of stuff like crime dramas, sci-fi, fantasy, horror. Yeah.
In fact, one of our first brushes, if I'm remembering correctly, was actually before we had officially met, because you had done done either the novel or you had done the script for a comic book called Fantastics.
Yes.
And
Actually, I did both.
Okay, you did both. And I had done the lettering on that, but we had never actually communicated, because it was actually someone else's idea, I believe.
Yeah.
So I had dealt mainly through him. So I was surprised one time when I was looking over your website or something. I'm like, wait a minute, Didn't I work on that?
Yeah, that was an honor because they hired me to write the comic, and then they were like, "Well, we think this would make a great novel. So can you novelize the comic?" So I wrote the comic, then I wrote the novel, but then the novel came out first. So yeah, it was a weird experience, but it was fun. It was I wish it had been out longer. I know they didn't keep it on sale very long. And
yeah, a few years back when I was updating links on my website, I was trying to find the links to it and like nothing. And
yeah,
I was disappointed because I was really proud of the lettering I did on it because I had really made a strong effort to kind of match the kind of like muted tones that they were going for in the cover.
because Daniel Serra did the artwork for that, and it was key, and he has that kind of painted
exactly, yeah,
lots of gray
mm-hmm.
to his art, and it just kind of give it that moody atmosphere, I guess. And
yes, yeah, and I was trying to keep in with that style with my lettering, and I was really proud of that work on that. So yeah, really disappointing. That was one of the lettering assignments that I'm the most proud of that is not published anymore.
Yeah, I've talked to the gentleman that owns it a few times about getting it back out there, and it just, I don't know why, but
well, what can you do?
I have one copy of each for me.
Oh, there you go. You got more than me.
Yeah, I managed to like hold on. I've been pretty good about that. I try to hold on to at least one of everything I've done, but it's not always easy.
Yeah, tell me about it. I've got because that was about 3 or 4 computers ago, so those files mostly I just have like a few random sample pages is all I got left. Right. But
if you ever need to, I can always scan some pages for you if you need them, because I do have the book.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, we can talk about that later on. That'd be definitely cool to have those all back in. But anyway, today we are talking about, and this is a movie that I have wanted to talk about, but ever since Derek's passing, I've been kind of reluctant to talk about because I know this was one of his favorite of the MCU movies, and that's Captain America: The Winter Soldier, which is, anyone you ask them about their rankings of MCU movies, this one almost inevitably will end up at least in the top 5, if not the top 3.
Yes, it's my favorite of the MCU movies. Because for many reasons. I mean, there are some of them I like that I might rewatch more because they're just more. There's a lot of fun to it. This is a pretty serious movie.
Yes,
but from the storytelling to the directing to the acting to this movie just kind of has it all and kind of nails it all.
In fact, I think I would probably go so far as to say this is probably the most serious of all the MCU movies.
Yeah, and probably because in for all the fantastic stuff that happens in here with, half human cyborgs that get thawed out every couple of years and giant helicarriers, it's probably the most realistically grounded of the movies too. It's not as out there.
And part of that is the way it was filmed too, because the Russos, and this was their first MCU movie, they were very intent on if we can do it practically, we're going to do it practically. Like they didn't want to use CGI unless they absolutely had to. And I think that definitely helps with the grounding feel of it. Plus the fact that it, the most, super powered stuff you get in here is you have Cap and you have Bucky, and that's about it. And there's nothing really else.
Right, because Natasha and Sam are all they're not super powered people.
Right.
Or Nick Fury, they're not.
I mean, you can make there's an argument about Natasha that's been debated about enhancements or anything like that. But yeah, you can make an argument either way for that.
Yeah. Right, but she's not lifting
exactly.
She's not ripping doors off cars like Sam, like Cap and Bucky are. But yeah.
But before we get too deep into the movie, tell me a little bit about your history with Captain America. Were you a big fan of the comics before that?
Yeah, I got into comics probably like most kids through Spider-Man. The cartoon was a big thing when I was a kid in the 70s. He used to come home and watch Spider-Man after school. And then, um, so I read some Spider-Man comics early. I read some Fantastic Four here and there, and then had a cousin that came and lived with me, with our family one summer, and he bought comics when after he was down for work, and he was reading comics I'd never heard of, and one of those was I had read there was a couple of issues of Captain America in there, and then when we moved, I was 12 when we moved, and the first guys I met at the new school were comic book readers. They were trading books off with each other. You know, they would each get their certain books a month, but then they would all get to read them because they would just pass them back and forth.
Right.
And it opened my eyes to, to a larger group of comics, and one of those comics was Captain America, because this was the mid '80s, so this was about the time where John Byrne was on Fantastic Four, Walt Simonson was taking on Thor, Frank Miller was doing Daredevil, and so Mike Zeck and J.M. DeMatteis doing Captain America. And I remember, because at the time that was when they were doing the time travel story with Deathlock, and that beautiful cover with Deathlock pointing and Cap in the crosshairs, and, you know, it was just this big, it was almost like their version of the Terminator, you know,
Right.
and which was set in the far-flung future of 1991. You know, where we had flying cars and all that stuff, you know, this post-apocalyptic world of 1991. But there was just something, I really just kind of fell in love with that run of the book and the character, and that made me go and pick up back issues later, and I discovered some great, you know, runs of the book through that. And then I read the book, excuse me, quite steadily up until like Heroes Reborn, and that's kind of when I stepped away from Cap for a bit. But there was just a lot of good stories there, and I really enjoyed them. And so, and different writers and different creative teams always had their version of Cap. You know, to some creators, he felt, some creators wrote him like he was your dad or your grandfather, because he was always telling people son, or calling people son, or making speeches, or. But there's a version of Cap that I love, where Cap decides that to take the show on the road, where he, if you remember this right, where he has the van and he's driving around the country, and he has the motorcycle in the back of the van, and he's just solving problems around the country. And I really loved that particular idea. And I get that feel is captured in this movie of, you know, because I don't always think of kind of like Wolverine. I don't always think of Captain America in the suit. Like, to me, Captain America can be Captain America riding the motorcycle in his civilian clothes.
Right.
You know, kind of like Wolverine. You know, I don't always think of Wolverine needing to be in the suit.
I actually prefer him out of the suit, just as a brief aside, anyway.
Right. So Captain America is not just something Steve puts on. Like, Peter Parker is Peter Parker until he puts on that suit. Then he's Spider-Man. There's almost a tonal shift in his personality. He starts being more jokier. Steve is, you know, Captain America is Captain America all the time, whether he's wearing the costume or not.
That's a really good point. I'd never really considered that. There are only a handful of heroes who really had that kind of quality. Like, you know, Cap and Wolverine, like you mentioned. Hawkeye is another one that I would probably classify in that. But most of them, like, you do a Batman story where it's Bruce Wayne and he's not wearing the cape and cowl, it doesn't feel like a Batman story.
Right.
But you could do a Cap story, you can do a Wolverine story where they never put on the costume, where Cap never puts on picks up the shield, and it still feels like a Cap story or a Wolverine story. That's a really good point that I never really considered before.
Yeah, because when I watch these movies, like, and these are not criticisms that I understand why these things happen. But like, if you watch any of the Spider-Man movies, not just the new ones, back to the Ted Raimi ones, he's always getting the mask taken off.
Yeah.
And it always annoys us as fans. He's not wearing the costume, you know. But when Cap's running around without the mask, it doesn't bother me, because I don't feel that he needs that. You know, it's not because it's not like he's becoming someone else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was something Derek and I commented on a bunch about how there's always that one scene where the mask somehow has to be destroyed or pulled off or something like that.
Well, and one thing I do think that the MCU did that I found really interesting, that the comics, well, I guess the comics do it now, but Steve had a secret identity in the
Yeah.
comics for a long time. So he did try to have that life where he had friends and family that didn't know who he was, that didn't know he was Captain America. The MCU has really, that has not played with that. He is, famous for he's recognized as himself.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a big difference too, is people know who he is, whether he's wearing that mask or not.
Yeah, that's a change that came about from the more recent comics. I believe it was the Ultimate Books that started it, and then John Nay Rebaer, when he was doing the New Deal story arc around 9/11, he had Cap reveal his identity to the world in the core universe, and it just made so much sense to me because and they did a similar thing with Iron Man. Like first in the Ultimate Books, he was, he had a public identity, and then in the comics he later did the same thing, and it made so much sense because the secret identity as a concept, it works for some characters, but it doesn't work for every character. Like,
right.
You got to have the secret identity for Spider-Man. That makes sense. You got to have it for Superman. You got to have it for Batman. But for Iron Man, I mean, guy's an egotistical son of a bitch to begin with. He's already a target because he's this wealthy industrialist who makes weapons. So he's already a target. So that's not an issue. And Captain America, like all the times when he's tried to have kind of a civilian life outside of Captain America, it never really quite worked for me. It always just felt like it was like they were doing this because they felt they had to do it.
Right.
And so it really made a lot of sense for them in this universe to just say, Iron Man doesn't have a secret identity. Captain America doesn't have a secret identity. That made so much sense. And they do it to great effect, and I think they really showcase why. I think going back to the first Iron Man movie, it proved it right at the end, right? He's Tony Stark. He wants everybody to see him. He wants everybody to know what he can do. So of course he gets up there and he's going to say, "Yeah, I am Iron Man. It's me."
Yeah. Plus, the big difference from the comic too is the amount of time Cap is frozen.
Yes.
Because then when he was reintroduced to the Marvel Universe in the '60s, it had only been 20 years, 20 years. That's not a huge gulf to, so Cap, and so those of us who have read the comics, Cap's been around a while, but with the MCU and their real time elements, he's been asleep for 70 years. The world is a massively different place,
right?
So to where his being found, that's news. That's not something they could have hid if they wanted to. That's that's going to get out there that this guy from the past, and so that it kind of makes him famous. Like I love the scene in the movie where he's at the Captain America museum piece, and the kid recognizes him.
Yeah,
and he's just going like, shh, that it's that kind of thing, that he would be that, in the real world. This is how he would be. It would be, people would be in awe of him.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, talking about influences, for me, I came in, Nay Rebaer was my first real introduction to the Cap comics. Like I'd read him in Avengers and stuff like that before that, but that was the first time I really started reading Cap semi-regularly. And then and I kind of dropped off after that with when Austin came on, but then I came back when they did when Brubaker came on, and that was just groundbreaking. I mean, it was just, and I think if you take all the Cap movies, this one feels they all have Brubaker influences, obviously, and they all take influences from different runs as well, and not only Brubaker. I don't want to besmirch Grunwald or DeMatteis or Englehart, any of those guys either, Kirby or Simon or any of those, but Brubaker's influence especially is all over this movie, and not just because of the Winter Soldier, but because of the themes that this movie was playing with. And I thought that was very powerful, because Brubaker, more than any other, the only other writer in recent memory who really brought that heavily into it at that time was Avery Beer with the 9/11 stuff, and he was only on it for about what, like, nine issues at the
it
most.
was a short run.
Yeah, because then then he had done 2 arcs, and then after that Austin had come on, and after that it just went back into the regular superhero standard type stuff.
Yeah.
But then
But
Brubaker,
that was when there was Marvel Knights, right? Marvel Knights was
yeah. And then Brubaker came on after that, after the disassembled stuff, and then he had brought a lot of that political intrigue and stuff that you hadn't really seen. You gotten hints of it during Grunwald's run, but I don't think you'd really have to probably go back to Englehart, where it was really as strong as it was during Avery Beer or during Brubaker.
Yeah, and I think too with Brubaker, because Brubaker is primarily a crime fiction writer. That's what he excels. If you've never read Criminal, I highly recommend going out and finding Criminal or any of the stuff that he and Sean Phillips have done over in Image. Their new Reckless books are it's like a pulp novel in comic form. And so he writes that kind of gritty noir crime thing well. And I remember when it was announced he was coming on Captain America, he had done like GCPD and some Batman.
Yeah, Gotham Central. And he had done Batman for a little bit.
Yeah, so he had done that in Sleeper and things like that. So
right.
But he wasn't really, even though he had worked on some Batman, he was not really thought of as a superhero writer. And so I remember there was when it was announced that he was coming on the book, there was some people going, oh, what's this guy going to do? Because I don't want my Captain America to be a crime comic. But he turned out some spectacular stories, and they gave him some fantastic artists.
Yes, yeah. That was Steve Epting was amazing on that.
At the beginning, it's just that first issue is just incredibly.
And I was really surprised because I remembered Epting's art from some Avengers stuff right around the time of Onslaught, and I'm not sure if it was him doing something different with his art, or if it was the inking or the coloring or what exactly it was, but some combination of it. It just looked. It was the best I'd ever seen Epting's art.
Yeah, well, when he was doing the Avengers, he had just followed up John Buscema's run, and the way the Avengers worked at that time, he wasn't fully drawing it. He was basically doing layouts, and Tom Palmer was doing the finished art. So that's why it looked a little more like Tom Palmer. But the first time I got a real inkling of this style from Steve Epting, there was El Cazador was a pirate comic that he had done with Chuck Dixon wrote, where his art started to change into what we now think of as Steve Epting art. And so just beautiful. And I remember picking up the first issue of Captain America that they worked on, because it started over with a new issue #1.
Right.
And the first thing I was blown away by was the cover. And I also didn't, I went into it cold. I knew he was on the book, but I didn't, I wasn't searching the internet for information up front. I wasn't, so I read it cold. And so the Bucky reveal, really, when we find it, because it's several issues in before we get the Bucky reveal, it was a big shock to me, because there was kind of this unspoken thing in comics, is this like, there are only 2 characters that can never come back from the dead: Uncle Ben and Bucky.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people when it was hinted at, because people were guessing, who the identity of the Winter Soldier. There were several people who guessed Bucky, and people were like, no, can't be Bucky. That would never work. Bucky would never work. Can't do it. But by God, they made it work. They made it work well.
Yeah, it was, because I had come to it. I didn't read it right at the start. I had read it afterwards, and so I'd known about the Bucky thing when I actually got down to read it. And when I heard about it, I was pissed. I'm like, you can't do that. That's breaking the rule, right? Like you said, I'd argue three. There's Uncle Ben, there's Bucky, and there's Thunderbird from the X-Men.
Yeah.
But I'm like, you can't bring back Bucky. That's just, there's no way they can make this work. This is terrible. This is a terrible idea. Then I read it, I'm like, shit, this is really fucking good.
Right, because Bucky's death is so instrumental to the modern day, Cap psyche. Why, Bucky's death has weighed on him for so long. So to take that away, that'd be like saying Martha and Thomas Wayne don't die,
right?
Bruce, or Uncle Ben doesn't die. So it was one of those weird things that just, it felt odd. But the way he wrote it, and also the putting the context of their ages, because the way Simon and Kirby did it, or Lee and Kirby wrote later Captain stories that set during the war, Bucky always seems so much younger,
right,
than Steve. But by the time we get to Brubaker, he's like, really, there's only like 2 or 3 years difference in their age.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Cap just seems older.
Yes, and not only that, but just the way that Brubaker reconceptualized Bucky, even in World War II, because you had, and in a way that actually makes sense. Because when you're looking back at those old stories, the whole idea of like, there's this kid on the army base, he finds out, Captain is Steve Rogers, and then he's like, well, now you have to be my sidekick. And it's just like, it's
no training, no nothing.
No training, no, it's just such golden age cheese, right?
Yeah.
And it's, and that's fine for that time. But when you're trying to tell these stories in a modern setting, it does not work.
Yeah.
And he had this, and Brubaker had this brilliant idea where it's like, no, that was just the cover story. Yeah. Really, Bucky was up to some shit. And
because Steve is the face, he is the poster boy for the American way. So we don't want to see him throwing grenades and shooting enemy soldiers. That's what we got Bucky for.
Yeah.
And and so I agree with you. I thought that was a brilliant piece of writing of their history, and it really made sense. And then how he brought Bucky back, and because there's a lot of contrived ways to have characters still be young 70 years later, and I thought they handled it brilliantly.
Yes, yeah, it's that is one of the books where I point to, and whenever people start bitching about something that's being done in comics or movies before they actually see it, I'm like, just watch it, read it, then bitch about it. Don't, because you might find out it's actually better than you expected.
Yeah. So when I heard that they were making the movie, there was a part of me that was a little, sometimes you go, "Ooh, how are they going to adapt something that's this good?" Not that I didn't, and the MCU was still, this was what, phase 2, so
yeah,
so still fairly new,
right?
So. And I had never heard of, the Russo brothers at this point, or, but I was like, I knew, because I knew the comic story, and the comic story is pretty involved. I mean, we're dealing with that plays out over like 50 some odd issues.
Oh yeah. It goes.
It's a long story. And so there was a concern in my head, was like, how can they condense all of this into, and make it fit with the MCU. Were they going to bring the Red Skull back? Were they, because the Red Skull does play a role. And so there was a lot of that stuff. It's like, how are they going to squeeze all of this in? And by God, they made it work.
Yeah. I mean, and kudos to Marvel and Kevin Feige for having faith in the Russos, because like you said, you hadn't heard of them, and really nobody really had at this point. The only things they'd really done is they directed some episodes of Community. They'd been writers on Arrested Development. They were known for comedy shows. So trusting Captain America and such a serious, movie to these, two unknown directors, it was a gamble, and it paid off in spades, because this movie, because the first Captain America movie, and pretty much all the early MCU movies, you had Iron Man, which everybody loved, and you had Avengers, which everybody loved, and in between, it was kind of rocky terrain. Like, you had You had like me, I love them all, but there was definitely mixed opinions on those pre-Avengers, post-Iron Man movies, and and Captain America, I think, probably got it worse more than any other. I remember, at least back at that time, it got a lot more criticism than I remember getting Thor or Incredible Hulk or even Iron Man 2 in some respects. And so, and there was a big question of like, what are they going to do with Captain America now? And so when we had all kind of expected they were going to do something with the Winter Soldier, because you had Sebastian Stan in the first one, and then he quote unquote dies at the end of the movie, and you with disappearing, falling off the train, you're like, yeah, he's coming back. We know he's coming back.
Yeah, if you don't see them dead,
mm-hmm.
they're probably not dead.
Yeah. So. But just like everything in this movie, just from start to finish, and I want to jump right into it right from the start, because, touching on something you had mentioned earlier, was the whole idea of Cap in the comics always being depicted as your grandpa, right? Mm-hmm. Which I agree with you. It's always been kind of annoying and really this movie took the smart idea. It's like, well, wait, he went into the ice when he was like, 21, 22 at the most. Mm-hmm. So he comes out, he's still that same age.
Yeah.
And it's just like, imagine you at 21 or 22 suddenly awakening in a brand new future. When I was 21, 22 when like the social media started coming out, or when the iPhone came out and stuff like that, and I wasn't baffled by it. I wanted to know about it. I wanted to find out about it. And they extrapolated that to, well, yeah, for someone in their early 20s is going to be that curious about new technology, imagine how they're going to feel in a whole world of new technology.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I thought the differences too between the Cap in the comics and the Cap in the movies. In the comics, Cap was Cap through most of the war.
Mm-hmm.
He's out fighting these battles, and in the course of, in the concept of the MCU, in that first Captain America movie, he is only Captain America a very short time. So it's still new to him when he wakes up out of the ice. It's he is a veteran soldier, but he didn't have years and years and years and years. He maybe had a couple.
Right.
Just during the course of the war. And I think some of the best things that really sell that is at the end of the first Captain America movie, when he finds himself in Times Square.
Mm-hmm.
Because earlier in the movie, he's running through New York, and New York looks vastly different.
Right.
And this is like and especially, the modern day Times Square with all the projection cameras and the plasma screens,
mm-hmm.
and the bright lights. The culture shock of seeing New York at the beginning of that movie to seeing New York at the end of that movie, it is very much oh my God, I'm in the future.
Yeah.
Because this does not look right.
Mm-hmm.
And I, the comics have been, there was a time there where the comics played up with this man out of time aspect, where I remember there was this big thing about he didn't know how to use the internet in the comics. And I was like, okay, Captain America flies Quinjets at the Avengers mansion with the Avengers computers. The man knows how to use the computer.
Mm-hmm.
But they kept playing it. Oh no, he's like your grandfather. He doesn't know how to use all that, and I never cared for that. So like there's a scene in Winter Soldier when he's talking to Sam, and he's like, Sam's asking, is it culture shock, or is it how different is it? And he's naming off things that are better now. He's like, the future, it's really nice now. The internet, oh, so helpful, And I was like, that one line really redeemed that other story for me, because if you woke up today, the internet is like, because back in his day, how hard was it to get information?
Mm-hmm.
Especially about other places. Like what I knew when I was a kid, I grew up in the 70s. When I was a kid, what I knew about the other side of the world either came out of an encyclopedia, or I might have caught something on TV.
Yeah. If you really wanted to go in depth, you had to go to down to the library and dig out the microfilms or something like that.
And unlike flash forward to today, where you and I are having this conversation on two different continents.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a real time conversation. And it's like the future is pretty damn awesome. Pandemics and shit like that aside, it's pretty damn awesome. So
yeah, and that line, that always line jumps out to me when it's like, internet's so helpful. I'm like, well, yeah, obviously, because if you have this device that has all the information literally at your fingertips, you're not going to be baffled by it. You're not going to be scared by it. If you're a guy in his early 20s, you're going to be like, holy shit, let's see what I can find out then.
Yeah.
Right. You're just going to go down the rabbit holes. Yeah.
It's like, man, how could we have used this back in the 40s?
Because I just remember back when I first discovered the internet, back when I was like, 11 or 12 or something like that, when and it was on my mom's work computer when I went to visit her at her office, and just like being amazed, just like diving down rabbit holes, like, oh, I can search for this. Oh, let's see what this link leads me to. And someone who's discovering the internet for the first time, that's what they're going to be doing. They're not going to be, I mean, he grew up in, he went to the ice in 1945. He didn't go into the ice in 1675. So.
Right. Because he was used to technology, because he was certainly using it in the Army. Right. He was fighting these Hydra super soldiers and their advanced technology. And he knew how to fly a plane, and like he flies several planes in this. And I mean, he's not a stupid guy. And I think sometimes the comics just like to play him up as like, yeah, he's your grandfather. And I was like, no, he would adapt.
Exactly. Yeah.
People adapt with the times. He's not always going to be. Yeah, he might be that when he first comes out of the ice, but as he gets older and goes on, he's still living in the modern world.
Well, also something else about that too is your grandfather's not your grandfather because he grew up in the 1940s. He's your grandfather because he had lived past the 1940s up until the present day.
Exactly.
I mean, if you went back in time and you spoke to your grandfather back in 1945, he'd be a very different person than he was when he was in his 60s or 70s.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times people, when they get to that age, they recall things with a more fondness, because they have changed. If you were, if in the 60s they're telling you about something that happened in the 40s, they're looking through 20 years of history that they've gone through. Right. And no one's at the same place they are in their 20s when they're in their 40s. I just turned 50. I look at my 20s a lot differently than I did 10 years ago. And, and I think, I've adapted. I'm older than you, so I started that when I first got on the internet. I was in my 20s, so there was a small learning curve, but it was this thing of holy crap, I can find this stuff, and there's I can find like-minded people who like the same things I do. I can talk to comic fans or movie fans, and it was great. It was like a holy crap. It was like it's a comic convention on my computer, and that was my first thoughts of it. Was like this is a wonderful tool.
Yeah,
and to this day, it is a wonderful tool, especially as a writer. And I'm sure you're the same way. It's like you're writing along, and it's like, oh, I need to look something up, and it's click, found it.
Yep.
Back to work. It's not. I got to go to the library. It's
got to dig out the atlas or something like that. Just like Google Maps, find out exactly what you need.
Yeah, it has become a wonderful tool, and so I'm glad to see that in the movie Steve really really uses it as such. And I like the idea too of the notebook. Him writing down. People are like, "Oh, you missed Star Wars. You've got to see Star Wars." Great, okay, Star Wars.
I made a point this last time to pause it when they did the close up of the notebook, and just to make sure read everything they had in there. And just like some of the things, they make sense, right? Like Star Wars, Star Trek. But I was like, he had like Thai food on there and stuff.
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, I also understand too. The list is different depending on what country it aired in.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I heard about that too.
Because the one that always jumps out at me is it says Rocky 2. It's like they don't tell them to watch Rocky; they tell them to watch Rocky 2. So, but it's good stuff. I love and I love when we see him later when he goes to his apartment, and Nick is in the apartment, and so when Sharon tells him, "Oh, you left your stereo on," he knows something's up, so he comes in through the window instead of the door. There's a great shot where he's coming through the window. It's shot through his bookcase. And so seeing some of the books he's reading to
Right.
get caught up on the modern world. And it's a lot of, yeah, he's not reading a lot of stuff like, oh, what I write. He's reading stuff about history, and
Yeah. All the
he's
Predators
catching,
Men was definitely one of the books on there, I remember.
yeah. So he's catching up on all this stuff and soaking it up like a sponge. But there's also this dichotomy to him where he's still the guy that loves 40s music.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's his, that's his music. And so there's that nice dichotomy where Steve is this old-fashioned guy, but he's also realized this is where I live, and he's in very much in the present too. So
Something else I noticed about that, just kind of a brief aside, but that song playing, it was the same song playing at the end of Endgame when he goes back with Peggy. Now, maybe you remember because it's been a while since I've seen it, but did that song feature in First Avenger at all, or was this the first time it was featured?
that's a very good question. I honestly don't remember. I know there was music from the era in the first of it, so it may have.
Yeah.
Because Steve in these movies is very influenced by Peggy. So a lot of times, like if Peggy may have been listening to it and he may have liked it because she did, or he was very influenced by her.
Right.
And I thought that was another brilliant thing about the movie that caught me off guard, that I did not expect Peggy Carter to be alive in the movie. So
this was actually a scene that they had originally planned to do in Avengers. But they ended up, I don't think they ever even filmed it. They'd ended up cutting it in the pre-production stage just because there was so much other stuff going on and it slowed down the movie too much. So they decided to save it for this film. I'm not sure if they rewrote it at all or if it was just the basic idea that was the same, but it was originally, the idea was they were going to do this in Avengers, but then they decided to hold it off and do it in Winter Soldier instead.
Yeah. And it really cements too, Peggy Carter is so important to the MCU. I mean, she shows up in small doses in various places, but she is such an important part. And I really just figured that, so when we cut to this scene and he's there, we don't see who he's talking to at first. And when I realize, oh my God, Peggy Carter is still alive, that it's this beautiful, touching scene, which becomes heartbreaking when her Alzheimer's, because apparently she has Alzheimer's, and they're talking, and it's this nice, sweet reunion type thing, and then she slips, and she's like, "Oh my God, you're alive!" And then it becomes heartbreaking.
One of the things that kills me about that scene, and you're right, that moment when she slips into the Alzheimer's is heartbreaking. But what makes it even more heartbreaking for me is Steve's reaction, because it's not one of surprise, it's one of expectation, like sad expectation. Like, you get the sense that this is not the first time this has happened.
Yeah, I assume this is not their first conversation. Yeah.
And that's what kills it. It's just like he keeps going back to her and he keeps sitting there. And every time this happens. Right.
And I give Chris Evans a lot of credit too, because in that scene, I just watched it last night, so I'm a little more fresh on it. But you really do see he brings that. You can tell he's struggling there, because, and yeah, that's what made me think this is not the first time this has happened. And because by the time Winter Soldier comes out, he's been out of the ice long enough to acclimate himself, work, do missions. So obviously, yeah, I'm assuming that's not the first time. But you see this moment where she slips and then recognize him, and like it's the first time she'd seen him. You can almost tell it's like he's fighting back tears, and then he goes into the my best girl, I couldn't leave my best girl, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's heartbreaking on a lot of levels, and then pays off in the next movie too, when in Civil War, when Peggy dies.
Yeah.
And it's of all the great stuff that's in that movie, that small scene really gets me every time.
Yeah. And it's, this I think was the movie that really, like, I know, when before Chris Evans had gotten cast as Captain America, I'm just like, I'd seen him in the Fantastic Four movies, and he was probably the best thing about those movies, him and Michael Chiklis. but I didn't see anything in those movies that made me think he was a great actor, like a phenomenal actor. Like he was good. He was, he definitely fit the part. So when he's cast as Captain America, I'm like, really? I don't know about this guy. But First Avenger, he sold me on that. Avengers, he sold me on that. And I'm like, okay, yeah, he's good. He's good. In this movie, he blew me away. Like this movie, I'm just like, no, this guy's got some serious chops.
Probably in Avengers is where it happened for me, but it solidified it in this movie. This is Captain America.
Yes, yeah.
When I read a Captain America comic or anything now, I hear Chris Evans' voice.
Yeah,
it's kind of like the Bruce, the Kevin Conroy with Batman.
Right.
That's he's become my Captain America.
Well, it's kind of interesting too that you mentioned that. I was thinking the same thing, because just like Christopher Reeve kind of created this kind of ideal Superman that was not quite what you had seen in the comics, but was definitely influenced by the comics. Then he had added his own spin to it. And same thing with Conroy's Batman. It was very similar to the comics, but there was some, there's some stuff that wasn't in there as well. It's the exact same thing with Chris Evans and Captain America, and Downey and Tony Stark as well, I'd argue too. Yeah. These aren't exactly the characters you got in the comics, but there's this synthesis of the best qualities that they have in the comic books mixed with some new stuff that those actors brought to those roles.
Yeah, and I think Evans does really good because he can go from that authoritative, because as Cap, he can give orders, and we've got a plan. Let's do this, and but he can also then he's still the guy who cares. There's little just tidbits in these movies that show that with, how he interacts with, Nick when Nick's in his apartment. There's a bit of misgiving. He's like, I'm not sure what to trust, but there's also that, are we friends? That kind of, I want to be this guy's buddy, but I don't know if I can trust him, to where, once Nick is shot and presumed dead, that, when he's with Alexander Pierce, and we've got to talk about Robert Redford too, but when he's with Alexander Pierce, there's a hardness starting to Steve there, where he's like, Nick said, trust no one, I'm going to find out, and so becomes this hardness to him as he's going along, and his anger with Natasha for hiding stuff from him, or, and you can tell too that she is kind of, even though she hides it well, she's a bit in awe of him too, that the fact that he's upset with her bothers her.
Yeah.
And she doesn't really seem to be bothered by that with anybody else, but there's something about, you want this guy to be your buddy. You want this guy to be on your side. And I think they really, really sell that.
Something that Evans does really well, and I think really suits Cap's character perfectly in a way that isn't really captured so often in the comic books. They often portray him as just like, a soldier straight up. But when you look at Cap's history and the history of the era he grew up in, the circumstances he grew up in New York, during the New Deal era, and he was in the heart of, progressive, creative stuff happening, and he was an art student. That's what he was doing, and then you take that guy and you put him in the military, and I think Evans perfectly captures that dichotomy. Like, you can see this guy as a sensitive artist, but you can also see him as being a guy who's been to war, who's been through the military, who's been through basic training and all that stuff, and he manages to perfectly blend those two competing ideologies, one of which is not really showcased that much in Cap comics and in Cap stories in general. And I think Evans really seemed to grasp that.
Right. Because at the core of, and there's a reason this line is so often quoted, even once he becomes Captain America and he's super strong and all this, there's a part of him that's still that scrawny guy that says, I can do this all day.
Right. Yeah.
And there's they repeat that line, in Civil War, and
in every movie.
it's become but at his core, that's Steve. This is a guy, he's never going to quit. He's not going to give up. He'll die trying to solve, like, he's willing to die in this movie to save Bucky. And I thought that was another change to the movies that really worked, because in the comics, like you said, Bucky was a guy he met. He was already in the army undercover. He was already Captain America when he meets Bucky. Having them be childhood friends I thought added a layer to the love between these two characters.
It completely cements the idea that these two are brothers. That
yes,
and that was something that Brubaker had keyed in on, and he felt that made the most sense. That's why he made the change from the father and son dynamic, because, you know, let's be honest, the reason they did that was because of Batman and Robin, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Brubaker wisely said, no, well, let's change that because that doesn't make sense. And these movies completely cemented as making them brothers, and it works so much better. It's such a better relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's what really helps salvage Bucky.
Yes, yeah.
Helps him break the Winter Soldier part of the programming. Is, you know, had this been a guy he had only met in the service, they might not have been as close. But the fact that they had grown up together, and, you know, there's this great flashback scene in Winter Soldier where they're coming back from the funeral for Steve's mom.
Yeah.
And Bucky's like, you can come stay with us, you know. And Steve has a lot of pride. He's like, no, I can do this, you know, and I can do this on my own. And Bucky goes, that's the thing. You don't have to do it on your own.
Right. Yeah.
And then that gets reversed when, you know, they're Captain America and the Winter Soldier, where he's like, no, you know, Bucky, you don't have to do all this alone. I'm here. And I think that really, that it starts to come through because Bucky saves Steve at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's just well written and well thought out, and yeah, I could gush over this movie all day. It just, you know.
One of the things I want to touch on is just how prescient this movie is, right? Because this movie came out in, what was it, 2014, 2014, yeah. Yep,
2014.
2014, this was really before we knew what social media was doing to everybody. This is before we had seen really the resurgence of fascism all over the world. And I'm watching this movie just, you know, literally like, you know, a few hours before we sat down to record this episode. And I'm just like, my mouth is practically hanging open, because it's just like they predicted all of this shit without coming, like, they don't meant. You see that when that scene with Sitwell on the roof, when he's going over all the things that, you know, that Zola's algorithm can determine about you. He never once mentioned social media.
Right.
Because this was before we had known what social media was capable of. But still.
But he does have that line, though, about, you know, this is the 21st century. Everything is digital.
Yeah.
Everything is, you know, is online, and it is true. We do trust these things way too much.
Yeah.
You know, if we ever had one of those big EME things and took out the computers, a lot of us would be screwed, because, you know, a lot of people run their houses off these things, or, you know, I don't know if I could go back to typing on a typewriter. You know, but yeah, it's but yeah, I remember thinking too. I mean, the idea of Nazis having, you know, and let's face it, they don't call Hydra Nazis, but they were Nazis.
Yeah.
You know, that they have infiltrated since the end of World War II, have been infiltrating all of this stuff. And there is this part where you as the audience in 2014 goes, well, that's a good story, but it never happened. You know, and then we see, you know, we see what has happened in the intervening years with the rise of fascism again, and you know, insurgencies on the capital of the United States. And I mean, there's just, you know, and a lot of it's like, holy crap, you know, I feel like I've stepped into that comic book world a little bit.
Yeah.
And I will say, you know, in terms of casting, you know, this movie, I mean, let's face it, this is a hell of a cast. You know, with Chris Evans, you know, Samuel L. Jackson, Anthony Mackie, Scarlett Johansson, Sebastian Stan are all fantastic. Robert Redford, whoever thought to cast Robert Redford? And if I remember correctly, he had pretty much retired by this point.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. So to get him to come do this big movie, and
thank his grandkids for that, because his grandkids are big Marvel fans.
Yeah.
And so when he was offered this role, he thought it'd be fun for his grandkids to see him in a Marvel movie. So, you know. Robert
I love
Redford's
it when stuff.
grandkids, thank you.
Yeah, I love it when stuff like that happens too, because I'm a big Star Trek fan, so I love like Star Trek Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek, and this is a quick aside, but like there's a three-parter that kicks off their second season where Frank Langella is the villain, and he is absolutely phenomenal. He's not even listed as a guest star; he gets no credit. And someone asked him in an interview, one, why did you do it, and why does it no credit? And he says, well, the salary that is required, for me, they can't meet. So I did it for scale. As long as they couldn't so if they didn't put my name on it, they could just pay me scale. But I did it because my grandkids wanted me to do it. And he's like, my kids the kids wanted me to do this. And so I did it. And it's the same kind of thing. It's like we as the audience have lucked out because my God, Robert Redford as a Hydra villain, is perfect, and he plays it so well.
One of the things that really jumped out to me rewatching it is just how, if you go into this movie not knowing anything about it, Robert Redford's turn is a complete surprise to you.
Well, not only his, because if you come to it from the comics, Alexander Pierce is not a bad guy in the comics,
right? Yeah.
Sitwell is not a bad guy in the comics. So the fact that they both turn out to be Hydra, as an audience member who knew these characters from the comics, there was a holy crap,
Yeah.
That was a shock. Now, the fact that Rumlow was going to be a villain was not a surprise, because I know that's the guy that becomes Crossbones.
Right, yeah.
So that wasn't a surprise that he would be a villain. But, so I mean, there was a lot of that stuff that just, I give them credit for it, because it does keep those of us that think we know the history of the characters on our gap, But yeah, brilliant. And not only just Robert Redford, but they stacked the World Security Council scenes with some fantastic, character actors.
Yeah.
And the great Jenny Agutter, who I remember way back when from Logan's Run, and she was also in the Avengers, and so yeah, just smart character choices and actor choices to fit those roles.
What really stood out to me about Robert Redford is because you go back to the 70s when he was in his heyday, and he was doing all these political thriller movies, and he was always the guy fighting against the conspiracy. And they start to play that in this movie, right? They play him as if he's going to be like almost like a mentor to Cap, or like a misguided antagonist, right? Because you get the sense that, well, maybe he's being played himself, right? And like the scene where he calls Cap into the off, and like his scenes with Samuel L. Jackson are great, because you get the sense that they really are friends, right? The whole thing is like, hey, look, I'll do this for you, but after this, you got to make Iron Man come to my niece's birthday party, and he's like, and he's got to mingle. He can't just fly by, and I love that line. And then when he meets with Cap, and he's telling Cap that story, and about Nick Fury selling secrets, and Cap's like, if you really knew Nick Fury, you know that wasn't true. And then he says, why do you think we're talking? And you get the sense like, oh, he knows something's up too, and he's going to work with Cap, and he's going to be kind of like the mentor figure. And then it flips, and it's brilliant. And you get suspicions that maybe he's being played or something, but that scene when the Winter Soldier shows up in his house and he takes the gun and he kills his mate, that's when you're like, oh fuck.
Yeah, because there's a moment there where you're like, it's gonna go either way. He could die, because then he kind of stares down the Winter Soldier, and there's this like tense moment when he goes, "Want a glass of milk?" And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I see." But yeah, it's just he is, the caliber of acting in this movie. I can't I can't gush over it enough. And I also enjoy Maria Hill. Kobe
she's
Smulders
great.
is Maria Hill. When they cast and I'm blanking on her name, the woman that plays Sharon Carter.
Emily Van Camp.
Thank you. When they cast her, I remember my first thought was that's not Sharon. Because again, from the comic, I had an idea of Sharon in my head. I was very impressed by her. There's a great scene in there where the Rumlow has the gun to the Tech's head and says
Mhm.
launch, and the fight happens, and it's quick, and I've noticed that some people tend to miss it. That she saves that guy's life
Mhm.
by kicking his chair over
Mhm.
just as Rumlow shoots the gun. And I was like, I really kind of like, I was like, okay, now it feels like Sharon.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and although I don't love what they've done with Sharon, because of just the character, I think it's great storytelling, but because it's out of character for the character I know.
Right, right. Well, I mean, they had to do that was one of the you could kind of see like the way things were they were initially thinking things were going to go because they start setting up Sharon here as the love interest, but Peggy just proved to be too popular and too much of a strong staying force that they ended up going back to her eventually in the end.
Hmm.
And then they got to figure out something to do with Sharon.
Yeah, because I know when we, not to get too far, when I was watching, when Falcon and Winter Soldier was playing, and I was talking with friends about it, they're like, "Oh no, no, Sharon's going to be the power broker," and it's like, "No, no, I know who the power broker is. I've read the comics." And then Sharon comes into the power broker, and I'm like, "Damn it!"
One thing I really want to talk about is Anthony Mackie because I had seen him before this in Hurt Locker, and that was really the only thing I'd really seen him in. But from the very first moment he's on screen in this movie, he just completely sells that character,
Yeah.
and he is just and like I've liked Falcon in the comics. I never had anything, but I wouldn't call myself a Falcon fan, right?
Mm.
After this movie, I'm just like Falcon is amazing.
Yeah, I again, because of the era I grew up reading him, I was a fan of the Falcon, so I was very excited to see the fact that he was going to be in the movie. He's he's quite changed from the comic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the comic, although at the beginning I get there's a little hints of it because he was a social worker,
Right, right.
and so we kind of see him doing that with the folks at the VA
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning of the movie. But I liked the fact that he was, before he puts on the wings, he's just a normal guy that Cap connects with.
Yeah.
And they do have that connection to where when Cap's feeling, off and it's not right, he does go down to talk to this guy
Mm-hmm.
because he understands, where the soldier in me is coming from. And I just thought that was a wonderful bit of connectivity. So even if he didn't become the Falcon later, I love the fact that, he made that connection with someone who's not
Mm-hmm.
part of this super powered world that he lives in.
Right.
And then, when he comes back later and says, everybody, oh, we need your help. And she's like, everybody we know is trying to kill us. And he's like, come on in and, can I help some out? There's a lot there. And, this is not pun. The pun is intended here. Anthony Mackie's Sam is a great wingman for Cap
Mm-hmm.
because, he's like, okay, Cap needs help. I'm going to do whatever he needs to help him.
Mm-hmm.
Like he has that great line, don't look at me, I do what he does, only slower.
I was thinking exactly the same line too.
Yeah, it's, and at the very beginning, it's you're going to do this, right? You don't have to help me. I know. When do we start?
Mm-hmm.
He's there. He's like the modern day equivalent of the relationship with Bucky.
Exactly. Which I think makes the antagonism between them so great that begins in Civil War.
Right, because because we feel that way with Civil War, and then through Falcon and Winter Soldier, especially.
Mm-hmm.
Steve is the only thing that's kept them two from killing each other.
Yeah.
And then as they grow like through Falcon and Winter Soldier, they do kind of grow together. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Steve was the only thing those two guys have in common, and and wanting to especially after Steve's gone,
mm-hmm.
wanting to measure up to what Steve believed in them.
Yeah.
Becomes it's a big motivating factor. I mean, it's Falcon and Winter Soldier. Steve Rogers' DNA is all over that.
Oh,
he
yeah.
Is,
yeah.
Even with him not being in it, he is a very heavy presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so his his impact on those characters is so very important. And and I love the idea too. I kind of look at it as one of the regrets that we didn't get it. I would have loved to have seen, and this is probably the closest we got to it. I would have loved to have seen a Shield movie with, you know, Nick, Natasha, maybe Clint, and you know, the not we're not out hulking out and fighting aliens. Just a nice political thriller, which is what we got here. But I always thought it would have been really cool to see, you know, see a nice Shield centric movie.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree, and I felt a lot of that too, and a lot of this movie, and like I enjoyed Agents of Shield for what it was, but I did wish it was more like this movie.
Right, because Agents of Shield was kind of they're Agents of Shield, but they're going to be over here doing this stuff, you know, and I will say that because Agents of Shield started before this movie came out,
yeah,
and then the events of this movie, Shield is no more at the end of it, and the TV show kind of languished in that just case of the week thing until this movie came out. And I remember the week Winter Soldier came out, that week on Shield, Hydra, you know, started taking out people, and so it really that was back when the TV show tied into the movies more than it did later.
Right.
And
before I started throwing his sissy fits.
Yeah, and I thought that made Agents of Shield better because they were dealing with the Hydra stuff, and we got that great stuff with you know Bill Paxton playing the villain there, and you know, and Samuel L. Jackson showed up on the show, and there was that nice crossover with all that, but yeah,
it was definitely when the show was at its best, was that post Winter Soldier era. So like that at the end of the first season and up until about I think it was about midway into the second season that it really kind of that golden era really kind of lasted, and after that it just kind of slid back in its old format. Another thing I really liked about the thing with Sam Mackey was just that, and like you mentioned with the connection and how Steve goes to him at the VA, but also when they first meet and Sam, you know, diagnoses exactly what's wrong with Steve, right? When he says it's your bed. Your bed's the problem, right? It's too soft, right? And it's just, and you know, Cap just completely relates to him. And it's not only the fact that, you know, Cap was in a war zone for all that time, but also that he was in ice for 70 years. So that it kind of connects to that as well.
Yeah. And yeah, because he kind of, you know, because the way they meet, you know, Steve's kind of putting on this like bravado that Sam sees through immediately. Yeah. And of course, Sam knowing who he is too, you know, he's you know, he knows what this guy's gone through. But the fact too, I think that one of the things that the script smartly does is he's not in awe of Cap. Like he's not gushing, he's not fanboying over meeting Cap. He's like, you know, when he introduces himself as, you know, he's Steve Rogers. Yeah, I kind of figured that out. And you know, the fact that it was two guys connecting as opposed to hero worship or celebrity worship or whatever, you know, oh my God, you're, you know.
And I think that's one of the things that makes, exactly. I think that is one of the things that separates Sam, because you see it, you compare it to like when he meets Coulson in Avengers, and Coulson's just like in that wonderful scene, right, where Coulson's just like completely fanboying out over him, and you get the sense that Sam is the first guy who hasn't done that,
right?
And that,
yeah, absolutely.
And that really forms that connection. The only other thing to mention, I think, really in this movie is Scarlett Johansson, and I really thought that they did a great job of, because you know she was in Iron Man 2, and you know she looked great, but she didn't really have much substance to her in that movie other than that. And then in Avengers, she got a little bit more, but this, like, you could have called this movie Captain America and the Black Widow, and the title would have totally fit.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is my favorite depiction of Natasha in the MCU so far. I did love her solo movie, but I really like this version of her, where she's we see her. This is the Natasha I grew up reading. She's the spy. She's the, she's good on her own. She's the, again, it's like the thing where you don't send Captain America to throw the grenade. You send Bucky. Yeah, you don't send Captain America to do espionage. You send Natasha.
Yeah.
And she is so good. There's a great line in there where she says, I don't really know everything. I just act like I do.
Yeah. I love that line.
And that's a good one. There's a lot of great, and again, it's like with the Sharon Carter thing, kicking the guy out of the way. There's some great moments that I in talking with people, I realized some people miss, like in the car when the Winter Soldier lands on the roof and they start shooting. That she is, she comes over the back seat, pushes Cap against the door, and then pushes Sam against the other door with her foot because she knows where the bullets are going. Little things like that. That's just they're not like focusing on it, but they're just quick things. Or like when Batroc throws the grenade and Cap pops it away with the shield and he's running toward the window. Before they crash through the window, she shoots the window.
Yes, yeah, I noticed that
so
too.
So it's when he hits it with the shield, it's already cracked and they go through easy. So stuff like that is just, it's brilliant. Certainly Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson have fantastic chemistry. The stuff in the mall, how uncomfortable he is, and the way that they're talking and their dialogue back and forth, the way they're together, and stuff like it. Just they have an awesome chemistry. I could watch the two of them. Yeah, I could have watched more movies of the two of them teamed up and doing stuff.
One of the things that I loved about that scene with the grenade and jumping through the glass window is that it perfectly encapsulates that these two characters, that even though they're at odds with each other at that moment, right? They're in this argument over their differences. When shit goes down, they put all that aside and it's all business. And I love that aspect of their relationship, is that they can debate when they've got the free time, but when it comes down to do the mission, they're going to do the mission.
Right. And because several times throughout the course of this, they're saving each other.
Yeah.
She makes it so they can get away and they're not caught. When Arnim Zola is keeping them busy. And by the way, I never would have expected to see Arnim Zola in a movie.
I think that was the only time we'd seen him. Well, obviously in Winter Soldier, and First Avenger, but
right.
And also the Nick Fury TV movie where he was just this old guy in that. But this was a brilliant way to take the really kind of wacky sci-fi Kirby-esque version of Arnim Zola and work him into this very grounded movie.
Yes, and I thought Toby Jones too, especially the way he talks as Zola in the computer. Yeah, it really works, and I just I never thought I'd see that. But when the missile's coming in there, Steve's saving her, and she's so there's a lot of good back and forth. And I thought Scarlett was fantastic. The bit at the end where she's doubling the Jenny Agutter's character and shocks herself to there's just a lot there, and not only does she have great chemistry with Chris Evans, but her and Samuel L. Jackson together are absolutely fantastic.
I was going to mention the vulnerability that she shows when she thinks that Nick Fury died was some of the greatest acting that Scarlett Johansson's ever done, I think.
Oh, that little whispered, "Don't do this to me, Nick."
Yes, yeah.
And that's another thing too. That's how close not too many people are calling him Nick.
Exactly. Yeah.
And and there's another movie, one of the other Captain Marvel. They did. It's like, no, I'm Fury. Nobody calls. So there's only a few people that now they call him Nick more in this movie than any of the others. Plus, Alexander Pierce calls him Nick.
Right.
And I think at one point Steve calls him Nick. But when they're talking about him, but not talking to him.
Right.
And but it was good stuff. And Fury was not problematic. Problematic's the wrong term. But the Fury of the comics and the Fury of the MCU are two vastly different characters, because the Fury in the comics has that World War II experience with Steve. And they've had to come up with various ways to explain why he's still, not older. Whereas the Fury in the movies doesn't have that World War II experience. So when they're
Fury feels a lot more like a product of the Cold War, which
absolutely
gives him a very different perspective on the world than Steve has, and I think that plays off very well for the two of them.
Yeah, and because their discussion in the elevator when they're going down to Insight for first time for Steve, and they're talking, it starts out so innocent. Oh, these used to play music,
and
he tells that story about his grandfather, and I was just like, and then we learn out later that scene seems such just a character building scene, but it becomes important later when we find out that Nick's, the way Nick's like manipulating things. But I love the dynamic that they have, because it is different than what I was used to reading in the comic, but I still think it works. And I think this movie is really where it solidifies that trust between Fury and Cap.
Yeah.
Because even though it was there a little bit in the Avengers, it wasn't, it solidifies it here.
Yeah. One of the things I like about that this movie does, and this is probably the last thing we kind of touch on here, but is that, and I love when comic books or movies or whatever it is, when they do this, when they find a way to integrate real world history with this, fictitious supernatural world. And they do that perfectly well with Operation Paperclip and working in the whole Hydra thing with that. And it's so seamlessly done that if you don't know about the history of Operation Paperclip, you would be forgiven for thinking that Marvel made that up. Because it works so perfectly here. I don't know. Bobby, do you have any other things you want to add about this movie?
I also, we haven't really touched on the action scenes. There's some fantastic action in this movie. There's a lot, that opening scene, the opening mission after the opening scene where they're on the Lemurian Star is absolutely fantastic. I love that scene, seeing Cap, how they did it where Cap uses his powers, and that scene, that certainly the freeway chase scene, is absolutely fantastic. And and 3 helicarriers battling it out over Washington D.C. is pretty impressive.
One of the things I love about the Lemurian Star scene is just the way they depict Batroc, and because Batroc so often in the comics ends up being depicted as a joke character.
Yeah, very goofy.
Yeah, but here they take a very serious tack with him, and I really love what they did with him in this movie.
And I love the fact that they kept him in the comic colors.
Yeah,
because he wears this yellow and purple, and it's like, well, that'll never work. But by God, there he is in yellow and purple. But yes, no, he was a great surprise, because you're right. In the comics, he is Batroc Ziliper. He talks that very parody almost of a French man, which they do later. He's like, they call him French. He said, no, he's Algerian. And
I love that too, like tying him into the politics of French and Algeria and all that. I thought that was great too.
And a character too, I never expected to see him again after this, but when he shows up in Falcon and Winter Soldier, it's like, oh my God, I'm so glad, and the guy plays him well. The fight between him and Captain America is really good. And that guy's a professional fighter that plays him, and so they were really good. And so they didn't joke him up, which I liked, and because I've always felt that because sometimes people go, oh, certain characters don't work, and so I think you can write some characters. It's just how you write them.
Exactly. Yeah. And
so this is one of the evidence that I point to is like Batroc in the comic is a joke. Batroc in the MCU, not a joke. It's so how you depict them can play a big part. But no, the action scenes are absolutely fantastic. The this is also a movie, because I know people who are not superhero fans that are like, can you recommend me if you want to recommend a Marvel movie to someone that's not into superheroes, this is the one.
Yeah.
And
I'd say it'd
also,
be this one or Guardians of the Galaxy, depending on where their
yeah,
tastes lie.
yeah, yeah. If you're a sci-fi fan, definitely Guardians.
Mhm.
But also more so than the other characters, because there's 3 Iron Mans, there's 3 Thors. Those still feel like 3 individual movies.
Mhm.
The Cap trilogy really does feel like three, 3 interconnected movies,
Mhm.
because so much plays from one to the other.
Yeah.
There's stuff that goes through, like even Civil War, which is packed with characters. It doesn't feel like an Avengers movie. It's still a Cap movie
Yeah.
with all these Avengers in it. And that's not hard. That's not easy to do,
Mhm.
because there's so many awesome characters in that movie. Cap could easily get lost in the shuffle, and
One of the
doesn't.
things, one of the things Derek always said was that the Cap trilogy is really kind of the crown jewel of the MCU,
Mhm.
because you've got 3 movies that are all good, that all work together, and all work in different ways.
Mhm. Absolutely. Derek and I talked about, yeah, we gushed over Cap quite a
Mhm.
number of times, and yeah, there's a lot to these movies that are just so well done.
Mhm.
My biggest regret is that Chris Evans is done. That we're not
Yeah.
going to get another Captain America movie.
Well, we are
Or
just not with him. We're
right.
not going to get
Well,
another
yeah,
Steve
right,
Rogers
right.
movie.
But I almost hope, there is a small part of me that hopes that maybe in 10 years they pull like a Logan
Mhm.
and give us like an old man Steve.
Well, I think
You know,
Chris, if I'm not mistaken, I think Evans made some comments recently saying that kind of left the door open for that possibility. So
right.
so we
Well,
might
and I
get.
know I've heard the rumblings that with the
Mhm.
multiverse stuff that's in this new phase,
Right, right.
there's a possibility of seeing some of these characters that are no longer there,
Mhm.
just from different universes.
Well, one of
And
the things I would love to see, and this is just my kind of like little, this is like my little fanboy thing, is because at the end of Endgame, Steve goes into the past and he creates this alternate reality where he lives with Peggy, and Steve Rogers is not going to sit back and do nothing.
right.
Right. That's not in his character. That's completely antithetical to what his character is. Just like he says in Civil War, right? If I see a situation pointing south, I can't ignore it. And
Mhm.
I would love to see, like, get Chris Evans and Haley Atwell and Sebastian Stan to do voices and do like an animated series of movies, or an animated series or whatever, set in this alternate reality where Cap was alive at the end of World War II and he knew everything going forward, and he was able to and see how drastically the world would have changed.
Yeah, right. Because if it wasn't an alternate reality, because yeah, he kind of creates an alternate reality. Because if it didn't create an alternate reality, our reality would have changed. Because
Mhm.
obviously, with Steve going back to her, Peggy didn't marry whoever she married,
Right.
doesn't have those kids,
Mhm.
and who knows what those kids might have grown up to do.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff that could have, could drag. It would be a drastically different world.
Yeah.
And play, yeah, you're right. 9/11 probably wouldn't have happened
Mhm.
because Steve Rogers knows that happens. Or many things. I mean,
And then you
the
get
the
and then you have the Batman situation, right, where it would the villains exist in Gotham if Batman wasn't there. So
mhm,
if you have Captain America there the whole time, maybe things wouldn't have been like they were in our world, but how would they have been different? I think that
mhm.
would have been really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I like I said, and this type of story too, the type of story that we get in this movie doesn't work for a lot of the other characters.
Right.
Like an Iron Man movie, this couldn't have been an Iron Man movie. You
Hmm.
couldn't just pull out Steve and put in Tony.
Right.
This is a movie that works for these characters, and I think that's important. Because as writers, we know that not every plot is for every character.
Hmm.
Some characters, that's not their story, and this is, even though it's a very shield heavy story,
Hmm.
it is a Captain America story.
In fact, I think this is the movie really when Marvel kind of cracked the formula and figured out this. Oh, this is the what we got to do with our movies is we have to take uh, because after you do the origin story, right, that's why Hollywood kind of falters on the superhero movies, because once you do the origin story and the hero's journey is over, where do you go from there? And I think this movie really kind of cracked it, because before this you had Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3, which didn't really quite hit the mark. You had Thor the Dark World, which as well still didn't really quite hit the mark. But this movie, they kind of figured out, okay, we do a political thriller movie with Captain America just happens to be the character in it.
Yeah. And still still loosely follows the format, because there is the big thing at the end. We're here at helicarriers, and so it still kind of follows that Bond format, action, big thing at the end. And there's a lot of action scenes in this movie.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I just, because I was thinking as I was watching it last night, it's like, it'd been a while since I'd seen it. And I was like, I know there's a good bit of action, but knowing we were going to talk about it, I'm focusing more on how many action scenes there are. And it's like, there's quite a bit. But also smartly, the downtime between the action scenes is still very good stuff.
Yeah. Very good.
And, yeah. So I'm in awe of the movie. It's still my favorite of the MCU movies, and I love it.
It's definitely up in my. I think it gets overshadowed by Endgame, and I guess I probably put it about it goes back and forth between this and Black Panther, like, because and it really kind of depends on my mood, because both of them have a lot of similar themes. They're both kind of dealing with these socio-political issues, and more so than any of the other MCU movies do, and I'm totally all about that stuff. So I love those aspects of it.
Yeah, I thought, and I think too, with characters like Black Panther or the Black Widow or the Falcon, because those are not the big characters. Like a lot of people know, whether you've seen the movies or not, you kind of know, you've heard of Captain America.
Right. Yeah.
And that's also one of the things I think that's helped the MCU, because when they started making these movies, they didn't have their A-listers.
Right.
They couldn't use the X-Men. They couldn't use the Fantastic Four. They couldn't use Spider-Man. And that was Marvel's big guns. And, a lot of people in hindsight don't remember. I mean, Iron Man was a risky proposition.
Yeah.
I mean, not only, but because really Iron Man was a C-list character at best at the time.
Yeah.
And Robert Downey Jr. was also not exactly who he is now. He was a risk, because
he was there was concern about whether or not they would actually insure him for the movie because of his past past indiscretions.
Right. So he was a risk. Jon Favreau was a risk. This was not a guy who was making a lot of big movies.
Yeah, the biggest thing he had done at this point was Elf.
Yeah. And so again, comedy guy. What does he know about superheroes? And so, but I think all of those things that were risks, I think worked for them, because a lot of people went to see Iron Man who had no clue who Iron Man was.
Yeah.
They went to see a Robert Downey Jr. movie. They didn't go to see a Marvel movie.
Right.
And I think that worked in their favor, because they could do things that weren't decried. Like, people know whether you've seen a Spider-Man movie or not, everybody knows who Spider-Man is.
Right.
Everybody knows who Batman is. Everybody knows who Superman is. And everybody has opinions of those characters. And over the decades that they've all been around, there are multiple versions of those characters. And so it's easier to disappoint. That's probably not the right word, but it's easier to disappoint fans who think, oh, Spider-Man, I love this version. Oh, they didn't do that version. I hate it. Whereas Iron Man, they're like, who? It's kind of like, like the Guardians of the Galaxy is another great example of that. Those characters had been around for decades, but outside of a small comic following, nobody knew who Star-Lord or any of those characters were.
Oh, and they made lots of changes to those characters in that movie.
Yeah. And so I think that has worked in their favor, because people didn't have the knowledge of them, whether based on anything. It's like I said, people know who Superman is, whether they've ever seen a Superman movie or not. They
Right.
have an image in their head of what Superman is. And usually it's the more cliche bits, the
Hmm.
up and away, the phone booth,
Right.
you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
that kind of, it's that. So, I was on a podcast recently. We were talking about public domain or writing old, public domain characters and stuff. And
Hmm.
the Sherlock Holmes is what got us on this topic. Was people have in their head what Sherlock Holmes is,
Hmm.
but if you're writing Sherlock Holmes, I can only use the original stuff. I can't use all the stuff that's been tacked on. Like with
Right.
vampires too. I can't use all the stuff that's been tacked on for years because that belongs to the people that came up with it.
Right.
And so, but yeah, so there's that consciousness of who these characters are. And I'm sure now, 10 years into the MCU, there are people that, oh, I know who Captain America is. I know who Iron Man is.
Hmm.
Or say in 20 years, they reboot them because it's inevitable. It's going to
Yeah.
happen.
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
They're going to reboot these, and there's going to be that great, no matter how good it is, there's going to be that group of people that are like, well, that's not my Iron Man.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
They're ruining my childhood, and
Hmm.
it's just another version of it. And I think, I can't fault the MCU. Like I said, I like some more than others, but there's not an MCU movie I've not liked.
Hmm.
I've enjoyed them all, and these actors have really come to embody these characters for me
Yeah.
to where they are my in my head version. So yes, in 10-15 years when we get an Iron Man that's not Robert Downey Jr., it's going to feel weird,
Hmm.
but hopefully, I mean, we're on our fourth Spider-Man. We'll survive.
If you
We're on
count
our
Nicholas Hammond, yeah.
yeah, we're on our 20th Batman.
Hmm.
There's yeah. So I mean, it's just one of those things. I mean, you just kind of have to roll with it, and it's,
Hmm.
do you like the character? Do you like the actor? And so yes, eventually, I love the fact that Sam becomes Captain America later on.
Yes.
I think that's perfect. I mean, and again, right out of the comics. I mean,
Hmm.
because we were talking about the Brubaker run earlier. They do kill off Captain America in that run, and he obviously gets better, but he's gone for a while. Where
Hmm.
the Captain America, the stars of the Captain America book are Sharon Carter, Bucky Barnes, Sam Wilson, and Tony Stark.
Hmm.
That's who the Captain America
And for
book
like a
was.
good year, it
Oh
was a
yeah,
Captain America book where there was nobody who was actually Captain America.
right. But again, just like with Falcon and Winter Soldier, the show,
Hmm.
he was so impactful to the book. It was
Exactly.
still
Yeah.
all about Cap,
Hmm.
and then Bucky, takes on the name for a good another year or so,
Hmm.
and then the original comes back, and so and then later Sam becomes Captain America in the comics, and
Yeah.
so seeing that, and I love the reasoning in the show why Bucky doesn't want to do it.
Hmm.
And Bucky really didn't want to do it in the comics. It was
He didn't
we're
want
gonna
anyone else to do it. Yeah.
yeah, it's like we're gonna have a Captain America. It's either gonna be you or it's gonna be somebody else. And he's like,
Hmm.
nobody else is doing this,
Hmm.
And so yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff there, and I think they've adapted a lot of that stuff well. Yes, I highly recommend the Brubaker run, as you mentioned earlier. He's actually in Winter Soldier. I don't know if you know that or not. Ed Brubaker
Oh,
is
really?
in Winter. He is one of the doctor that comes in when Alexander Pierce comes in. They've got Bucky strapped down, and the two doctors
Oh,
in lab coats.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, one of those is Ed Brubaker.
And one of the Russos is Nick Fury's
Yeah,
doctor too,
he's the doctor. Yeah,
who also plays one of the support group in Endgame as well.
yep.
So
Yeah,
my little headcanon, that's the same guy.
could be. Yeah. So, but yeah, so yeah, good stuff. Like I said, I could gush on this all day.
Mhm.
This was, I love this movie when I get up this early in the morning to talk about it.
All right. Okay, Bobby. Well, thanks a lot for coming on. Anything you want to promote? Anywhere you want to tell people to find you?
BobbyNash.com is my website. There's links to everything there. I do a lot of writing, so there's, check it out on there. I am on social media. Author Bobby Nash on Facebook, at Bobby Nash on Twitter, Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram. So, but all that's on BobbyNash.com as well, so you can find links and say hello.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming. This was a great chat. We'll have to come back on again at some point in the future.
Absolutely, this was fun. I've had like I said, I love these movies and these characters, so getting to talk about them I was surprised that no one had jumped on it when you were like looking for people. I'm like, really? No one's jumped on this movie yet?
I'm actually kind of surprised that, because Derek and I had mentioned this movie numerous times, and for some reason, I don't know if it was just because that Derek just wanted to focus on other stuff or what, but I was always expecting at some point he was gonna pick this movie, and we just never did. So. So it's glad we finally got a chance to talk about it and finally round out the Cap trilogy here.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's still my favorite MCU movie, and like I watched it last night, and I hadn't seen it in a while, and it was just as good.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, that does it for us. Thanks for listening, and you can find us superherocinephiles.com, Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can join the Facebook group Superhero Cinephiles. Just search for that, and it'll pop right up. And please, if you like what you listen to, if you like what you've heard, give us a review on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts, anywhere you listen to your podcast. And if you're interested in being on the show, superherocinephiles.com is a contact form. Just fill that out, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. You have been listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Super Cinema Pod. Join our Facebook group by searching for Superhero Cinephiles, where you can interact with us and other superhero fans. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a regular supporter at Patreon or make a one-time donation through PayPal, both of which can be found at our website, superherocinephiles.com. If you buy or rent any movies through the Amazon links at our site, it helps support the show. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.